Hello, everyone, and welcome to part one of exploring Charles III's ancestors. So, in case you're wondering, what the heck is this? Well, just check my last video where I go over what this project is. Essentially, I have gone through the entire ancestry of King Charles III so that we could guess what his DNA results would be if he took a DNA test. But to know more details about that, go watch the video. That's not what this video is about. Instead, here in part one, we are going to be looking at some of his most famous ancestors in order to get a sense of where the different ethnicities that he currently has comes from, as well as just explore some of the cool and famous people that he is descended from. So you might be wondering, who is the oldest known ancestor of the king? And the answer is likely a guy called Richomeres. Now you might be saying, wait, who the hell's that? Well, Richomeres is likely his oldest ancestor and can be traced back 52 generations. He was a Frank who served in the Roman army and was a comes, or a count, in 377 for Emperor Gratian. He escaped the Battle of Adrianople in 378, became the Roman Magister Militum in 383, and even became a consul in 384. And in fact, he even reached the achievement of becoming the supreme commander of the Eastern Roman Empire from 388 until his death in 393. Now, the reason that he is important is because his great-great-great-great-grandson was Clovis I. Now, Clovis became the king of the Salian Franks in 481. At the Battle of Soissons in 486, he defeated the Roman successor state of Soissons, led by Syagrius, which ended the final Roman presence in Gaul. 10 years later, he converted to Chalcedonian Christianity, establishing Christianity in France and becoming a saint. He was baptized on Christmas 508, and the next year became the first king of the Franks. This, in addition to his conquest of the Alemanni and his victory in the Battle of Vouille, in which he conquered Aquitaine from the Visigoths in 507, led him to be considered the father of France. He died in 511. Now, as for his ethnicity, he was half Frankish through his father and was half West Germanic through his mother, Basina of Thuringia. 7 generations later came Charles Martel. He became mayor of the Palace of Austrasia and Neustria in 717, which made him effectively the leader of those lands. He restored centralized government and began implementing feudalism. He's most famous for his defeat of the Umayyads at the Battle of Tours in 732, ending exactly 1 century of Muslim expansion since Muhammad's death. He was 95.75% Frankish, 1% West Germanic, and 0.25% East Germanic, but was also 3% Gallo-Roman. So where did this ancestry come from? Well, actually, Charles Martel's great-great-great-grandfather was a man named Ansbert, who was a Roman senator who became a Frankish noble, which is kind of funny because Richomeres was a Frankish man who became essentially a Roman magistrate. Now, his great-great-great-grandfather was a Roman politician and administrator from Gaul named Afranius Syagrius, who can be traced back 50 generations from Elizabeth and therefore 51 generations from Charles, making him the origin of Charles's Roman ancestry. He also lived at the same time as Richomeres and actually died earlier than him in 382. But since we don't know when Richomeres was born and we don't know when Afranius Syagrius was born either, he might actually be Charles's oldest ancestor. But either way, we know that they are of the same generation. And so essentially the contender for Charles's oldest ancestor is either a Roman or a Frank, but given that they were both basically sort of Frankish / Roman people in Gaul at the same time, I think we can sort of give that honor to both of them. Now, going back to Charles Martel, his son Pepin the Short succeeded him as mayor of the palace in 741, and then became the king of the Franks a decade later. 5 years later, in 756, he gave Rome to the Pope as part of what's known as the donation of Pepin, which created the Papal States in exchange for the Pope making only his family eligible as king of the Franks. Pepin was 98.5% Frankish, 1.5% Gallo-Roman, and 0.5% German, since by this time the distinction between the East and West Germanic peoples had basically disappeared, which led to the creation of the German ethnicity and culture. After Pepin the Short's death, his son Charlemagne succeeded him in 768. He conquered the Lombards and became their king in 774. In 782 he began his conquest of the Saxons, forcibly converting them to Christianity. His greatest achievement was being crowned the first Holy Roman Emperor on Christmas 800 by the Pope. During this time, the Carolingian Renaissance began, and because of his achievements, he's been called the Father of Europe for uniting Western Europe for the first time since the end of the Western Roman Empire. He was 99% Frankish, 0.75% Gallo-Roman, and 0.25% German. After his death in 814, he was succeeded by his son Louis the Pious, who had been king of Aquitaine. As king of Aquitaine, he had already conquered Barcelona, Pamplona, and the Pyrenees from the Muslims between 801 and 812. His mother, Hildegard of the Vinzgau, was half Frankish and half German, and this made Louis a quarter German and 3/4 Frankish. He was the last king of the Franks, and after his death in 840, the kingdom was divided in three. Now this is because his eldest son, Lothair I, had been co-ruling with him since 817, and therefore expected the inheritance to be divided between him and his brother Louis the German. However, some of Louis the Pious's possessions were supposed to be passed on to a son by his second wife, Judith of Bavaria, and that son was Charles the Bald. Now Lothair and Louis the German were not happy about this, and after their father's death they went to war with Charles. But after a 3-year civil war, they decided to split the kingdom of the Franks into three. Lothair became the king of Middle Francia, and this was added to his title of being the king of Italy. Also, crucially, he inherited the title of Holy Roman Emperor from his father, although this would soon become a more ceremonial title since he no longer controlled the lands to either his east or his west. He would eventually die in 855. Now, Lothair I was 87.25% Dutch, but you might say, wait a second, where does this Dutch come from? I thought his ancestry was Frankish. Well, this actually gets to the entire reason I redid this project. For those of you who missed this in the last video, essentially one day I was watching a video on whether the Franks were German or French, only to realize that actually genetically and linguistically they were the ancestors of the Dutch and not the French, even though the French are named after the Franks. And so while the French descend politically from the Franks, they were not the ethnic descendants of the Franks by and large, because the Franks were actually Germanic invaders from the Low Countries, and thus would not be similar to the Gallo-Romans, whom they conquered and who would eventually turn into the French. And so the reason that I started calling Louis the Pious' sons Dutch and no one before is because after the death of his father, the Franks essentially lost their distinct culture, so moving forwards, Frankish DNA will be categorized as Dutch here. Now, apart from his Dutch ancestry, Lothair was also an 8th German and 0.25% French. Now, obviously, being his full brother, Louis the German had the same genetics as Lothair, and he inherited East Francia, where he became its first king. Because this land eventually turned into Germany, this is why Louis is given the title of the German, despite being 7/8 non-German. Nevertheless, he was not content with just Germany and unsuccessfully tried to conquer West Francia from his half-brother Charles. He also tried and failed to become Holy Roman Emperor and King of Italy, but he died in failure in 876. Now, Charles the Bald, who was being invaded by him, would actually outlive him by 1 year, and as mentioned earlier, was the king of Western Francia, which would become France, making him the first true French monarch. In 875, he became the king of Italy and Holy Roman Emperor after the death of Louis II, the son of his hated half-brother Lothair I, before dying 2 years later. Ironically, though, for someone who was essentially the first king of France, just like his half-brothers, he was only 0.25% French. So what was the rest? Well, he was 68.75% Dutch, 28% German, and 3% Lombard. And the reason for the difference with Louis and Lothair is because, as I mentioned before, they shared different mothers. But whereas Charles the Bald in some ways can be considered as the first king of France, it wouldn't really take form until the reign of Hugh Capet, best known for founding the House of Capet, which would directly rule France until 1328, and would rule France until 1848 through various cadet branches. He was elected king of the Franks in 987 and ruled until 996. Ironically, despite being considered by many as the founder of France as we know it, he was actually 2/3 Dutch and 1/3 German, so basically was not French at all. Now, moving away from France, we get Charles's first English ancestor, Ealhmund of Kent, who was king of Kent in 784. However, not much is known about him, and his son is much more well known. His son Ecgberht was actually forced into exile into the court of another of his ancestors, Charlemagne, by the king of Wessex, who was named Beorhtric. However, after Beorhric's death, Ecgberht returned and became king of Wessex in 802. In 825, he defeated Bjornwulf of Mercia at the Battle of Ellendun, ending 200 years of Mercian domination, and becoming king of Kent as well. 4 years later, he defeated Wiglaf of Mercia and made Northumbria vassal, temporarily making him the ruler of the Anglo-Saxon lands before dying in 839. His son, Aethelwulf's youngest son, was Alfred the Great. He became king of Wessex in 871 and is most known for resisting Viking invasions, winning a decisive victory at the Battle of Edington in 878, after which he negotiated the creation of the Danelaw in the north and east of England. He also became the first king of the Anglo-Saxons in 886, making him the first king of basically what would become England. In addition, he began education in English instead of Latin and improved the English law, society, and army. His son, Edward the Elder, succeeded him as king after his death in 899, but faced the same challenge as his father after the Northumbrian Vikings invaded in 910. However, the Anglo-Saxon victory ended the Viking threat and allowed his conquest of their English territory throughout the next decades, with the exception of Northumbria, with his sister Aethelred, the Queen of Mercia. After her death in 918, her daughter Ealhmund succeeded her as queen for a few months before Edward brought her to Wessex and annexed Mercia. He died in 924. However, whereas Edward had saved England from the Vikings, his great-grandson Aethelred the Unready basically handed it over to them. His reign saw a notable increase in the frequency and severity of Viking raids, and after losing the Battle of Maldon in 991, he started paying tribute to the King of Denmark. In 1002, he ordered the St. Brice's Day Massacre, where he massacred the Danes in England, a decision that would haunt him when 11 years later, King Sweyn Forkbeard of Denmark would invade England and overthrow him, forcing Aethelred to flee to Normandy. Luckily for him, Sweyn died the next year, allowing him to regain the throne, but he would die just 2 years later. Now, Sweyn's father may have been Harald Bluetooth, who became king of Denmark in 958, and then became king of Norway in 970 after the assassination of its king. He is most notable for introducing Christianity to Denmark and for his symbol still being used for Bluetooth to this day. Meanwhile, Sweyn, his son, seized the throne from him in 986, but lost Norway in 995 to Olaf Tryggvason, but he regained the throne in 1000 after Olaf was killed in battle. As mentioned earlier, Sweyn became king of England in 1013, but this only lasted 5 weeks before he died. Now, another famous ancestor of King Charles was Rollo, its founder and first duke. He was a Viking who besieged Chartres in France, after which Charles the Simple, the king of West Francia, made him Count of Rouen in 911 in exchange for ending his raids in West Francia, swearing allegiance to him, converted to Christianity, and defending his land against more Viking raids, which he did until 928 when he died. Now, this land that would be granted to him became known as Normandy, and his descendants would become known as the Normans, who would be very important in the Middle Ages throughout European history. As mentioned earlier, he was a Viking, but there's no information on where in Scandinavia he was from, and he also lived 32 generations before Charles, so I will just put him as fully Norse in terms of his ethnicity. However, by far, his most famous descendant was his great-great-great-grandson, William I. He succeeded his father as Duke of Normandy in 935, but since he was illegitimate and was 7 years old, his land was devastated by nobles fighting each other, but between 1047 and 1060, he consolidated his power over them. Due to the fact that the King of England, Edward the Confessor, had no children, he became a claimant to the throne. However, at his death in 1066, English Earl Harold Godwinson claimed the throne for himself and defeated an invasion led by Harald Hardrada, the King of Norway. On his way back from the battle, William decided to invade England, since he believed he had been made Edward's heir and that Harold Godwinson had supported that claim. Beating Harold's tired troops at the Battle of Hastings that October, he was crowned King of England in 1066, becoming remembered as William the Conqueror. After consolidating his rule by 1075, he spent most of his time in Normandy, although in 1086 he ordered the creation of the Domesday Book, which was a survey that listed all properties in the land, and then he died in 1087. He's remembered for constructing many castles, creating a new Norman upper class, and reorganizing the clergy as king. Now, despite William's Viking origins, he was over 80% French. He was 80% French, and this was reflected in the culture and language he and his men brought over. Now, he was also an eighth Breton through his great-grandfather Conan of Rennes, the Duke of Brittany. This means that he was only actually 3% Norse, with that 3% coming from Rollo. Now, in 1135, William's grandson, Stephen, who was the son of William's daughter and the Count of Blois, became the King of England and Duke of Normandy. Due to his cousin William Adelin's death by drowning in 1120, he became a claimant to the throne, and after his uncle Henry I's death, he crossed the Channel and took the throne in place of Henry's daughter, Empress Matilda. Despite attacks on his land by her husband, as well as Scottish and Welsh wars, he managed to keep control. However, when Matilda and her half-brother invaded in 1139, he wasn't able to defeat it, and they took over southwestern England. He was captured at the Battle of Lincoln in 1141 and lost in Normandy 3 years later. However, the Civil War dragged on until 1153 when Matilda's son Henry invaded England and negotiated an agreement which made Henry Stephen's heir in exchange for peace, and died a year later. He was a little over half French, a bit under a quarter Dutch, an eighth Occitan, a 16th German, 3% Breton, and only 1.25% English. And then he was also 0.75% Norse, 0.5% Lombard, 0.25% Greek and Armenian. Anyways, that is all for this part. In the next video, I will be talking about some famous founders of countries across Europe and beyond whom Charles is descended from. So stay tuned for that, and I will see you next time.